They said the forest would swallow him whole, that a lone man, a wooden house, and sharpened fences stood no chance against winter hunger and wolves that had forgotten fear. But on one frozen night, when the wind screamed through black pine and shadows moved just beyond the firelight, everything changed. A single decision, quiet, deliberate, and unseen, became the difference between terror and survival. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silver Creek, Montana sat at the edge of what people still dared to call civilization. One main street cut through the town like a scar that never healed, lined with a diner, a general store, a post office, and a handful of buildings that had learned to lean into the wind rather than fight it. Winter arrived early here and stayed late, dragging its weight down from the mountains without apology. The air on that morning was dry and biting, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Frost clung to every surface, and the sky hung low and gray, promising nothing but endurance. People in Silver Creek understood winter the way a man understands a rival who has beaten him before. You didn't brag, you didn't argue, you prepared quietly and hoped you'd done enough. Elias Crowley rode into town just after sunrise. He came alone, save for his horse and dog, and he moved with the calm economy of someone who had learned that unnecessary motion wasted strength. Elias was 34, though the hollow lines around his eyes suggested a life that had pressed harder than his years. He was tall, lean rather than thin, with shoulders shaped by work instead of muscle for show. His face was angular, built from sharp cheekbones and a jaw that stayed set even when the cold reddened his skin. A short, dark beard framed his mouth, trimmed more for function than style, with a hint of gray beginning to settle at the edges. His eyes were a clear, steady blue, alert without being restless, the eyes of a man who watched before he spoke. He wore a heavy canvas coat darkened by use, leather gloves softened by years of handling reins and tools, and a hat that bore the marks of weather rather than fashion. Nothing about him looked new. Nothing looked careless either. The horse beneath him, Ash, was a thick-built gray gelding with a winter coat already grown and dense and rough. Ash stood solid and patient, the kind of horse that didn't spook easily and did not forgive foolish handling. His ears flicked often, tracking the sounds of town and wind alike. Behind them moved Bran, a large shepherd mix with dark fur and a broad head. Bran stayed close, his movements deliberate, his eyes steady and intelligent. He was not a dog that begged for attention. He watched. Elias dismounted in front of the general store and tied Ash to the hitching post. The wind pushed at his coat as he stepped inside, carrying cold with him. The bell above the door rang once, sharp and clear. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, lamp oil, dry goods, and wood smoke. A potbelly stove ticked quietly near the back, surrounded by two men who paused their conversation long enough to look Elias over. They didn't smile, but they didn't glare either. In a town like Silver Creek, strangers were not rare, but they were always measured. Elias crossed to the counter and laid down a folded set of papers. Harvey, the store owner, picked them up slowly. Harvey was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, his hands thick and scarred from decades of labor. His mustache was gray and uneven, and his eyes carried the tired sharpness of a man who had learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Harvey scanned the papers, then looked up. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Black pine," he said. "Yes," Elias replied. Harvey set the papers down and exhaled. "That's not close to town." "That's the point." The two men by the stove exchanged a glance. One of them, tall and narrow with a scarf wrapped tight around his neck, shifted his weight. The other, older and heavier, stared into the fire like he was remembering something he didn't care to relive. Harvey tapped the edge of the deed with one finger. "You been up there before?" "I have." "You know what lives out there?" Elias nodded once. "I do." Harvey studied him for another moment, then pushed the papers back across the counter. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" Elias began listing it. Supplies in a steady voice: flour, salt, coffee, lantern oil, matches, rope, canvas, a few lengths of chain, nails. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, like a man who had learned the value of preparation the hard way. He didn't ask for a rifle or ammunition, though the outline of one could be seen beneath his coat. While Harvey gathered the items, the man with the scarf cleared his throat. "You heading up there alone?" he asked. "With my horse and dog," Elias answered. The man nodded slowly as if confirming a suspicion. "That forest don't care how many friends you bring." Elias looked at him, calm and direct. "Neither do I." When the supplies were bundled, Elias carried them outside in 2 trips. The cold bit harder now, the wind picking up as if irritated by the intrusion of movement. Ash shifted once but remained steady. Bran sat near the door, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the buildings. Harvey followed Elias onto the porch. "I won't tell you what to do," he said. "But wolves don't behave the same when there's no road nearby. Hunger changes things." "I'm counting on that," Elias replied. Harvey frowned. "Most men wouldn't. That's why most men stay in town." Harvey gave a short, humorless chuckle. "If you come back missing something important, I'll pretend not to notice." Elias allowed a faint smile, barely there. He mounted Ash, nodded once in farewell, and rode out of Silver Creek without looking back. The road narrowed quickly, turning from packed dirt to frozen ruts, then to little more than a trail pressed into the earth by old wagons and occasional hooves. Fences disappeared, buildings fell away, trees closed in. The wind changed character as the land rose, losing its sharp edge and gaining a low, constant presence that whispered through the branches. Black Pine Forest began without ceremony. The pines grew tall and dense, their trunks dark and close together, blocking out much of the light. Snow lingered beneath them, untouched by sun. Sound carried strangely here. Every creak of leather, every breath, every shift of weight seemed louder, sharper. Elias did not rush. His posture remained relaxed, but his attention was wide. Ash's ears stayed in constant motion, and Bran moved slightly ahead now, nose low, tail still. They crossed a shallow creek skinned over with ice, climbed a narrow rise, and followed a barely visible path that twisted deeper into the trees. After several hours, the forest opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a log house. The cabin was modest and solid, built low to the ground with thick logs darkened by age. The roof sloped steeply to shed snow, and a small porch sagged slightly under its own weight. No barn stood nearby, no smoke rose from a chimney. The place looked like it had been built for survival, not comfort, and abandoned by someone who understood both. Elias dismounted and stood quietly for a moment. Bran circled the clearing once, reading the ground. Ash snorted softly, stamping a hoof against frozen soil. Elias unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was sparse: a table, a chair, a narrow bed frame, and a pot-belly stove in the corner. The air smelled of dry wood and dust. It was cold, but sound. The walls were thick, the windows small. He stepped back outside and surveyed the clearing again. The forest pressed close, a wall of dark trunks and shadow. The light was already fading, and the cold deepened as evening approached. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked. Elias rested a hand against Ash's neck, steady and reassuring. Bran stood near the porch, watching the trees without a sound. "We'll manage," Elias said quietly. It was not optimism, it was intention. As darkness settled over Black Pine, a single square of lamplight soon glowed from the cabin window. The forest did not respond. It simply watched. Morning in Black Pine arrived without ceremony. There was no gradual brightening, no soft color easing its way into the day. Light simply appeared, thin and pale, filtering through the pines like water through cracked stone. The cold had settled deeper overnight, hardening the ground and sharpening every sound. When Elias Crowley stepped out onto the porch, his breath rose thick and white, hanging in the still air before dissolving among the trees. Ash stood where Elias had left him, tethered near the edge of the clearing. Frost clung to the horse's mane and along the dark leather of the saddle. He shook his head once, sending a faint spray of ice into the air, then went still again. Ash was 8 years old enough to have learned patience and young enough to keep his strength. His broad shoulders and steady stance were the kind built by long miles, not breeding papers. He had been through storms before, and it showed in the way he waited rather than worried. Bran lay near the porch, his dark coat thick against the cold. He was 5, maybe 6, with a scar along his left flank where a wild boar had once caught him careless. That scar had changed him. He no longer charged blindly. Now he watched, measured, and chose his moments. When Elias opened the door, Bran rose immediately, stretching once before turning his head toward the trees. His ears were upright, his posture alert but controlled. Elias scanned the clearing before doing anything else. Tracks showed faintly in the snow at the edge of the trees, old ones, blurred by frost and time. Deer, by the look of them, possibly elk, nothing fresh, nothing close. That did not mean the forest was empty, it only meant it was patient. Inside the cabin, Elias lit the stove and brewed coffee strong enough to bite back. He ate quickly, standing rather than sitting, his movements economical. There was work to be done, and daylight, even weak daylight, was something to be used, not admired. He stepped back, outside, and began unloading the supplies he had brought from town. Rope, chain, nails, canvas. Tools he already owned were stacked neatly along the cabin wall: an axe with a worn hickory handle, a draw knife, a mallet, a handsaw whose teeth had been sharpened more times than Elias could count. He ran a gloved thumb along the axe handle, checking for cracks, then nodded to himself. The fence would come first. Elias had chosen the clearing carefully when he bought the land. It was just wide enough to give him visibility, just small enough to limit approaches. Trees stood close beyond its edges, thick and dark, offering cover to anything that knew how to use it. The cabin sat slightly off-center, its back facing a rise in the land where the forest climbed uphill. That direction worried him most. Predators favored high ground. From there, they could watch. He marked the perimeter with measured steps, pacing a rough circle around the cabin, not a square, not straight lines, corners. Created blind spots. Corners gave animals a place to pause unseen. Elias avoided them by instinct, shaped by nights long past when straight edges had failed him. He began cutting saplings from the edge of the forest, young pines and hardwoods, each about as thick as his forearm. He worked steadily, swinging the axe with controlled force, letting the blade do the work. Ash watched from his tether, ears flicking at each crack of wood. Bran paced the perimeter, stopping now and then to sniff the air, then resuming his slow patrol. By midday, Elias had a pile of cut posts laid out in the snow. He dragged them one by one into the clearing and began shaping them with the draw knife, pulling the blade toward himself in long, even strokes. He worked the tops down to sharp points, not needle-thin, but solid and unforgiving. These were not decorations. They were warnings. The work was physical, but familiar. Each post brought back memories Elias rarely revisited on purpose. Another cabin, years ago, farther north. Another winter that had arrived early and stayed cruel. Back then he had trusted walls alone. Back then he had believed distance from town was protection enough. He had learned otherwise the night something large tested the door, the night he had stood inside with a rifle shaking in his hands, realizing too late that fear traveled faster than thought. That night had taken more than sleep from him. It had taken his belief that isolation was the same as safety. He drove the first post into the frozen ground with a mallet, angling it slightly outward. The earth resisted, but Elias worked around it, chipping ice, adjusting his stance, striking again. When the post finally held firm, he stepped back and studied it. One was nothing. One was easy to ignore. Many would be a message. He continued in silence, placing each post an arm's length apart, close enough that nothing large could slip through without scraping flesh. The circle took shape slowly, deliberate and uneven, following the land rather than forcing it. Elias adjusted where rocks lay buried beneath the soil, where roots twisted just under the surface. He adapted rather than fought. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to thin again, a sound carried through the trees. Footsteps, careful but not especially quiet. Bran froze, head snapping toward the forest. Ash lifted his head, ears forward. Elias straightened and rested a hand on the axe handle. A man emerged from between the pines, stopping just inside the tree line. He was tall and spare, his frame long and weather-worn. His beard was gray and uneven, hanging down over a wool scarf. He wore a faded hunting coat patched at the elbows and carried a rifle slung low over one shoulder. His eyes were sharp but not unfriendly, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime watching things that preferred not to be seen. "Didn't expect company," the man said, his voice rough but calm. Elias nodded once. "Neither did I." The man stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the snow. "Name's Finn Calder," he said, Most folks call me Old Finn. I checked my traps up along the ridge. Saw smoke last night. Elias studied him briefly, then relaxed his stance. Elias Crowley. Finn's gaze drifted to the half-finished fence, taking in the pointed posts, the careful spacing. He let out a slow breath. "You planning to keep something out," he said, "or keep something in?" "Out," Elias replied. Finn nodded, as if that confirmed a thought he'd already had. "Smart enough. Wolves have been pushing farther this season, not rabid, just hungry." He shifted the rifle on his shoulder. "Most men don't bother with fences like this. Most men don't live this far out," Elias said. A faint smile tugged at Finn's mouth. "That too." Finn did not step any closer. He respected the boundary without being told. He glanced at Ash, then at Bran. "Good. Animals," he said simply. "They'll earn their keep." "They already have," Elias replied. Finn lingered a moment longer, then tipped his head toward the trees. "I won't bother you again today," he said. "Just thought you should know. You're not alone out here, even if you're the only one who chose it." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the forest, his steps swallowed quickly by the pines. Elias watched until the woods closed behind him. Then he returned to his work. By the time darkness crept in again, the fence was half complete, a rough arc of sharpened wood standing firm against the snow. Elias stood inside it, looking out, imagining the rest finished, imagining the way the clearing would change once the line was closed. The cabin already felt different, less exposed, less like a single target in a vast, indifferent land. He fed Ash, brushed him down, and checked Bran's paws for ice before retreating inside. The stove glowed steadily, pushing back the cold inch by inch. Outside, the forest shifted and murmured. Something moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of light. Elias did not see it, but he felt the attention, heavy and curious. He sat at the small table, sharpening the axe by lamplight, each stroke slow and deliberate. The fence was not finished. The night was young, and Blackpine was already taking note. The fence stood higher by the next morning, its sharpened posts forming a rough, uneven arc that caught the pale light and broke it into hard angles. Elias Crowley woke before dawn, the cold already settled deep in his bones. The stove had burned low overnight, leaving the cabin cool but not cruel. He moved quietly, adding wood, coaxing the fire back to life, listening to the small sounds that meant the world was still in order. Outside, Blackpine waited. Ash stamped softly near the tether, breath steaming, his gray coat rimmed with frost. He had slept standing, legs locked, the way horses did when they trusted a place just enough to rest but not enough to lie down. When Elias stepped onto the porch, Ash turned his head and snorted once, a greeting and a question wrapped together. Bran was already awake, sitting just inside the unfinished fence line, his dark body still as a stump. His eyes tracked the trees, following movement Elias could not see. Bran's scarred flank twitched. Once, a reminder of past lessons learned too close. Elias ate quickly and returned to the fence. The work continued where he had left it, cutting, shaping, driving posts into frozen earth. The rhythm of it steadied him. Strike, test, adjust. The forest did not interrupt. It watched. By mid-morning, new tracks appeared at the far edge of the clearing. Elias noticed them while dragging a post into place. Boot prints, human, fresh enough that the snow had not yet softened their edges. He straightened slowly, scanning the trees. 3 men emerged from the pines, spread loosely apart, rifles carried with the casual confidence of people who had used them often and without consequence. They stopped when they saw Elias, surprise flickering briefly across their faces. The first to step forward was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, thick through the chest and neck, his beard trimmed short and already streaked with gray. His face was square, blunt, with a broken capillary along one cheek that spoke of cold and whiskey. He wore a heavy wool coat and gloves patched at the fingers. His name, Elias would soon learn, was Cal Rourke. Behind him walked a younger man, late 20s at most, narrow-faced with pale skin and restless eyes. His beard was thin and uneven, as if he hadn't yet decided whether to keep it. He shifted his rifle often, adjusting the strap against his shoulder. This was Matthew Hale, a clerk from Silver Creek who hunted to feel less like what he was the rest of the year. The third man lagged behind, older than the other two, with a stooped posture and a long gray beard that fell to his chest. His coat was worn thin, and his movements were careful, economical. His name was Thomas Reed, though most people in town called him Tom. He had lost a brother to winter years back, and it had left him quieter, slower to speak. Cal Rourke took in the fence, the cabin, the horse, and finally Elias himself. His mouth curled into something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. "Well," Cal said, his voice carrying easily in the cold air, "looks like the forest grew itself a man." Elias rested both hands on the axe handle and waited. He did not smile. "You're a long way from town," Cal went on. "Didn't expect to find anyone living out here." "I could say the same," Elias replied. Matthew shifted his weight, eyes flicking to the trees. "We're hunting," he said, as if offering an explanation might smooth the encounter. "Saw elk sign up along the ridge." Elias nodded. "They move through here." Tom Reed cleared his throat. "We didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," Elias said, "just close." Cal's gaze returned to the fence. "That for wolves?" "For anything that doesn't understand doors," Elias answered. Cal chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "I've lived in Silver Creek my whole life. Wolves don't bother men who know how to carry a rifle." Elias met his eyes. "They bother hungry men who think they don't." The smile faded from Cal's face. He stepped closer, boots crunching, stopping just short of the fence line. "You saying we don't know what we're doing?" "I'm saying the forest doesn't care what you think you know." There was a moment of tension, thin and brittle as ice. Matthew glanced between the two men, uneasy. Tom watched quietly, his eyes narrowing not with anger, but with consideration. "We'll be on our way," Tom said finally. "No harm done." Cal hesitated, pride warring with sense. Then he snorted and turned away. "Come on," he said to the others. "Plenty of woods left." They disappeared back into the trees, their voices fading. Elias watched until the forest closed behind them. Bran moved closer to the fence, nose low, sniffing where the men had stood. His hackles lifted slightly, then settled. "They don't belong here," Elias murmured, though he was not sure whether he meant the men or the certainty they carried with them. The day wore on. Elias finished another stretch of fence, sweat freezing at his collar. The work kept his thoughts from lingering on the hunters, but the forest did not let the matter rest. In the afternoon, distant rifle shots echoed through the trees, 2 sharp cracks, then silence. Ash flinched at the first report, then steadied. Bran growled low in his chest, a sound that never reached his throat. Elias paused, listening. Shots meant men, men meant noise, noise meant movement, and movement drew attention. Toward evening, the wind shifted. It came down from the ridge, cold and steady, carrying scent with it. Bran's head snapped up. He moved to the fence and stood rigid, staring into the trees. Ash lifted his head, nostrils flaring, muscles tightening beneath his coat. Elias followed Bran's gaze. Between the trunks, just beyond the reach of the clearing's light, shapes moved. Not rushing, not careless. 3, maybe 4. Low to the ground, gray blending with shadow. Wolves. They did not approach. They did not retreat. They watched. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness sharpened to a fine edge. He stepped back inside the fence, positioning himself where he could see the widest arc. He did not raise his axe. He did not shout. He waited. The wolves lingered only a moment longer before melting back into the trees, silent as breath. But the message was clear enough. That night, Elias slept lightly. Sometime after midnight, Bran's growl pulled him from sleep. It was deeper than before, sustained. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand now, heart steady. He opened the door a crack. Voices carried through the forest, human, strained and urgent. "Cal, slow down!" "I told you, this way!" A crash followed, then a sharp curse. Elias stepped fully onto the porch. Lantern light spilled across the snow, catching movement at the edge of the clearing. The 3 hunters burst from the trees, faces pale, breath ragged. Matthew stumbled, nearly falling. Tom grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. Behind them, shadows flowed. Cal reached the fence first, skidding to a halt. His confidence was gone, replaced by something raw and animal. "Open it!" he shouted. Elias moved without hesitation. He swung the gate inward, ushering them through. The men spilled into the clearing just as the wolves reached the fence line. The animals halted abruptly, noses brushing the sharpened posts. One snapped, more in frustration than threat, and recoiled. The fence held. The wolves circled briefly, eyes reflecting lantern light, then retreated, slipping back into the dark. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were heavy breathing and the crackle of the lantern flame. Cal bent over, hands on his knees, chest heaving. His beard was rimmed with frost, his face drawn tight. Matthew sank to the qasid, ground, shaking, eyes wide and unfocused. Tom stood apart, leaning on his rifle, his expression grim but composed. Elias closed the gate and secured it. He turned back to them. "Inside," he said. "Now." They followed without argument. Later, as they sat near the stove, hands wrapped around tin cups of hot water, the truth came out in fragments. The elk sign had been old. The shots had been careless. The wolves had followed, patient and practiced, cutting off paths the men had not even known they were taking. Cal stared into his cup, jaw clenched. "I didn't think," he began, then stopped. Elias did not press him. Some lessons did not need help to land. Outside, Blackpine settled back into its endless watch. The fence stood between worlds, and for the first time, Elias knew it had already served its purpose. Morning came late and thin, as if the forest itself hesitated to loosen its grip on the night. Pale light filtered through blackpine in narrow bands, catching on frost and turning it to dull silver. Smoke rose straight from the cabin's chimney, a sign the air was calm but unforgiving. Inside, the men who had fled the wolves sat close to the stove, shoulders hunched, boots steaming as the last of the cold melted from leather and bone. Elias Crowley had been awake for hours. He moved quietly through the cabin, checking the latch, stirring the coals, measuring the morning by habit rather than clock. His face showed little of the night's tension, but the set of his jaw was firmer than usual. He had seen fear before, seen how it stripped a man down to what remained when pride fell away. Last night had done that to Cal Rourke. Cal sat on the edge of a chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. In the firelight, his broad face looked older than it had the day before. The hitut, confidence that once rounded his shoulders had collapsed inward, leaving him heavy and still. His beard was damp from melted frost, gray streaks standing out sharply against dark hair. When he spoke now, his voice was lower, careful, as if he no longer trusted it to carry him safely. Matthew Hale sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the wall, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. His pale face had regained some color, but his eyes remained unsettled, darting to every sound. He was young, 27, Elias guessed, too young to have learned the difference between courage and noise. The rifle lay untouched beside him, no longer an extension of his will, but a reminder of how little it had helped. Tom Reed stood near the window, staring out at the trees. His long gray beard had been braided loosely to keep it from catching on his coat. There was a stiffness in his posture that came not from fear, but from memory. He had lost his brother to exposure years ago, trapped by weather, after making a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Since then, Tom had trusted the forest only as far as it allowed itself to be trusted, which was not far at all. "You saved our lives," Matthew said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. He looked up at Elias with something close to awe. "If that fence hadn't been there..." Elias raised a hand, stopping him gently. "The fence didn't save you," he said. "It just gave you somewhere to stop running." Cal swallowed hard. "I didn't listen," he admitted. The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. "You warned us." Elias leaned against the table, arms folded. "Warnings don't matter much when a man's convinced he's right." Cal nodded slowly. "I've made a living on being right." "And last night?" Cal's mouth tightened. "Last night," he said, "I was alive because I followed someone who knew better." Silence settled again, heavier now, but not hostile. Outside, Bran lay near the fence, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. His dark coat blended with the shadow of the posts, scarred flank rising and falling steadily with each breath. Ash stood tethered nearby, chewing hay with deliberate calm, as if the events of the night had already been filed away as something survived. By mid-morning, the men prepared to leave. Elias walked them to the gate, the sharpened posts catching the light at harsh angles. Cal paused before stepping through, turning back. "I won't forget this," he said. "Not the fence. Not what I felt out there." "Good," Elias replied. "Memory keeps you alive longer than pride." Tom extended a gloved hand. Elias took it, the grip firm and brief. "You've built something important here," Tom said quietly, "even if you didn't mean to." After they disappeared into the trees, Elias closed the gate and secured it. The clearing felt different now, not quieter, but steadier, as if a balance had shifted. He returned to work. The fence needed finishing, reinforcing along the northern rise where the ground sloped upward. He cut more saplings, shaping them with the same patient precision. The work grounded him, kept his thoughts from straying too far into what might have been. By afternoon, a new sound reached him. Hooves, measured and unhurried. A woman rode into the clearing, guiding her horse with practiced ease. She dismounted smoothly, reins loose in her hand, and took in the fence and cabin with an assessing eye. She was in her early 40s, tall and straight-backed, with auburn hair pulled into a tight braid that fell over one shoulder. Her face was weathered but composed, skin tanned and lined lightly at the eyes. She wore a wool coat tailored for movement, not show, and gloves worn thin at the palms. "Name's Sarah Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, carrying the calm authority of someone used to being heard. "Tom Reed sent me." Elias inclined his head. "Elias Crowley." Sarah glanced toward the tree line, then back to the fence. "He said you kept 3 men alive last night." "I gave them a place to stand," Elias replied. "That's more than most," Sarah said. She rested a hand on the neck of her horse, a bay mare with a white blaze and intelligent eyes. "I track for the county when folks go missing. Wolves have been moving differently this season, not reckless, coordinated." Elias nodded. "I've noticed." Sarah stepped closer to the fence, examining the spacing, the angle of the posts. "You built this with the land," she said, "not against it." "I built it to be understood," Elias said. She smiled faintly. "That's rarer." They spoke for a while, trading observations. Sarah had grown up on the edge of another forest farther west, had learned early how predators tested boundaries before committing. She respected Elias's approach, measured, restrained, deliberate. Before she left, she said, "People will talk now, after last night." "I'm not looking for visitors," Elias replied. "You may get them anyway," Sarah said. "Fear travels fast." She mounted and rode off, her mare's hooves fading into the trees. As evening fell, Elias finished the last section of fence. He stood inside the circle, surveying the work. It was not perfect. The posts varied slightly in height and angle, but it was solid, honest, a line drawn clearly enough to be respected. That night, the wolves returned. They didn't rush the fence. They paced its perimeter, shadows sliding between trees, eyes glinting in the lantern light. One tested a post with its nose, then recoiled. Another sat back on its haunches, watching Elias through the gaps. Elias stood still, rifle lowered, breathing slow. He did not challenge them. He did not retreat. He held his ground and let the fence speak. After a long while, the wolves melted back into the forest. Elias extinguished the lantern and went inside. He fed the fire, checked the latch, and sat at the table. Outside, Blackpine resumed its endless watch. The line had been drawn, and for now, it held. The forest did not change overnight, but the way men moved within it did. Elias Crowley felt that shift before he heard about it, sensed it in the cautious quiet that followed the wolves' retreat, in the way Blackpine seemed to pause rather than press. Morning broke cold and gray, the sky low and unyielding. Frost glazed the fence posts, sharpening their points with a thin, white edge. Elias walked the perimeter at first light, testing each post with his weight, checking the ground for fresh sign. There were tracks, wolf, light and deliberate, circling without crossing. The message was clear enough. The line had been noticed. Ash stood tethered near the cabin, blowing softly into the cold, his breath rising like smoke. He had settled into the place with the calm acceptance of a horse that understood routine. Bran moved with purpose, tracing the fence from the inside, stopping where the wolves had lingered longest the night before. His ears flicked constantly, but his posture remained steady. The forest was not calm, but it was contained. By midday, the sound Elias had half expected finally came, human voices drifting through the trees, cautious and uncertain. He straightened from his work and waited. This time there were no rifles raised, no careless steps. 3 figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, spaced close together as if unwilling to be separated by more than a few feet. Cal Rourke led them, his broad shoulders hunched inside his coat, his beard trimmed shorter than before. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep alone, but from something heavier. Behind him walked Matthew Hale, pale and quiet, his movements subdued, as if the forest had taken something from him and not yet decided whether to return it. Tom Reed followed last, steady and watchful, his long beard braided tight against the cold. They stopped well short of the fence. "We didn't come to hunt," Cal said, his voice carrying without challenge. "Just wanted to talk." Elias nodded and unlatched the gate. He didn't swing it wide, only enough to invite without offering more than he meant to give. Cal stepped through first, removing his hat as he did so, a small gesture that would have seemed unthinkable days earlier. "We told people what happened," Tom said quietly. "Didn't dress it up." Matthew shifted, hands jammed into his pockets. "They don't all believe us." "They will," Elias said. "Eventually." Cal glanced at the fence, then at the forest beyond. "That tracker you spoke to, Sarah Whitmore, she came through town last night." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What did she say?" "That wolves are pushing south because the winter's been hard farther up, that men who walk into the woods like they own it won't walk back out the same way." Cal hesitated, then added, "She told them about this place." Elias absorbed that in silence. Attention was not something he sought, but neither was it something he could fully refuse. The forest made its own choices, so did people. They stayed only a short while, speaking little. Cal thanked him again, awkwardly, and Matthew offered a nod that carried more humility than words. When they left, Elias watched them go until the trees closed behind them, then secured the gate and returned to his work. The afternoon passed in steady labor. Elias reinforced the northern stretch of fence, driving posts deeper where the ground rose, tightening the line where the slope offered advantage to anything watching from above. His hands worked with practiced certainty, but his mind turned outward, measuring consequences. He had drawn a line not just for wolves, but for men who believed the forest bent to confidence alone. Near dusk, the sound of hooves approached, one rider this time, moving at a measured pace. Sarah Whitmore emerged from the trees, her auburn braid tucked beneath her collar, her bay mare stepping carefully over frozen ground. Sarah dismounted and tied her horse near Ash, the two animals regarding each other with quiet curiosity. "Town's restless," she said by way of greeting. "Restless people make poor decisions." Elias wiped his hands on his coat. "What kind of decisions?" "Some want to organize a hunt," Sarah replied. "Not for elk, for wolves." Elias frowned. "That won't solve what they think it will." "No," she agreed. "It rarely does. Kill a few, scatter the rest, and the hunger just spreads." She looked toward the fence. This changes behavior." They walked the perimeter together, Sarah studying the ground, the spacing, the wear patterns already forming where paws had tested wood. "You've forced them to think," she said. "Predators hate uncertainty." "So do people," Elias replied. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's why I'm here. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to help me keep things from turning ugly." Elias considered. He had chosen Black Pine to be left alone, but solitude did not absolve him from consequence. "What do you need?" "Eyes," Sarah said, "and restraint. You have both." They spoke until the light faded, agreeing on little more than observation and communication. When Sarah left, the forest swallowed her whole, leaving only the steady presence of the fence and the cabin. That night, the wolves returned again, but differently. They did not circle as a group. One approached alone, a large gray with a scarred muzzle, moving with the deliberate confidence of an animal that led rather than followed. It stopped at the fence, sniffed, then sat back on its haunches. Its eyes reflected the lantern light, steady and unblinking. Elias stood inside the gate, rifle resting against his shoulder, not raised. Brand positioned himself at Elias's side, low and still. Ash shifted once, then settled. The wolf remained a long moment, then rose and turned away, vanishing into the trees. Without a sound. Elias felt a strange certainty then, not safety, but understanding. The fence had become a language both sides recognized. 2 days later, the weather turned. Snow fell hard and fast, driven sideways by a wind that found every weakness. Elias woke before dawn to a sharp knock on the gate, urgent and uneven. He opened it to find Matthew Hale standing there alone, face gray beneath the frost. Tom fell, Matthew said, words tumbling. Ice near the creek. He can't walk. Elias moved instantly. He saddled Ash, grabbed a blanket and rope, and followed Matthew into the storm, Bran trotting ahead, nose down, tracking despite the snow. They found Tom near the frozen creek, leg twisted at an angle that told the story plainly. Tom's face was set in pain, but his eyes remained clear. You shouldn't have come, Tom said through clenched teeth. You shouldn't have gone alone, Elias replied, already working. They built a sled from branches and rope, secured Tom carefully, and led Ash back through the trees. The storm pressed close, but the path held. When they reached the fence, Elias opened the gate wide, bringing Tom into the circle of sharpened posts and human intention. The wolves did not appear that night. Tom stayed in the cabin for days while the storm passed. Elias set the leg as best he could, splinting it with care. Sarah rode in when the weather broke, bringing supplies and news. The town had decided against a hunt, for now. Fear had been tempered by example. When Tom finally left, leaning heavily on a crutch, he stopped at the gate. You've given people something to think about, he said. That's rarer than shelter. Elias closed the gate behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet. Black Pine remained what it had always been, hard, watchful, alive. But now there was a line within it, drawn not in defiance but in understanding, and for the first time since Elias had come, the forest seemed willing to listen. Winter tightened its grip on Black Pine with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The storm that had broken Tom Reed's leg did not truly leave. It simply thinned, retreated, and waited for another opening. Snow lay deeper now, packed hard where the wind scoured it clean and piled waist-high where the forest shaped its own traps. The fence around Elias Crowley's cabin stood rimmed with ice, each sharpened post dulled slightly by frost, but no less resolute. It marked a boundary that had begun to matter, not just to wolves, but to men. Tom Reed remained inside the cabin longer than either he or Elias had planned. His leg healed slowly, the break clean but stubborn, and the cold did nothing to help it. Tom bore the inconvenience without complaint. He was a man in his early 60s, tall even now despite the stoop that pain forced into him, his beard long and gray, his eyes pale and thoughtful. Losing his brother years earlier had carved something permanent into him, a carefulness that bordered on reverence when it came to the forest. He spent his days seated near the window, carving small figures from scraps of wood, watching the trees as if listening to a language he no longer tried to argue with. Matthew Hale came often, trudging in from the direction of town with supplies slung awkwardly over his shoulders. He had changed since the night of the wolves. The nervous energy that once drove him had drained away, replaced by a quieter focus. He moved more slowly now, noticing where he stepped, where the wind cut hardest. His beard had grown fuller, uneven but earnest, and his eyes no longer darted constantly. Fear had not left him, but it had settled into something usable. You learn fast, Tom told him one afternoon, watching Matthew stack firewood with care. Or you don't learn at all. Matthew nodded. I didn't know how loud I was before. Elias listened without comment. He understood the shift. Survival had a way of stripping men down to their habits and rebuilding them only if there was time. Sarah Whitmore returned less often now, but when she did, she stayed longer. She brought news, quiet updates rather than gossip. The town had avoided a wolf hunt, though the tension remained close to the surface. Ranchers along the southern edge of Silver Creek had lost calves. Fear still wanted an outlet. Sarah rode through it with steady resolve, her auburn hair now streaked with gray at the temples, her posture straight despite the miles. She had seen cycles like this before, panic, reaction, regret, and she was determined not to let Black Pine repeat the pattern if she could help it. One evening, as light drained from the sky and the forest settled into its watchful hush, Sarah lingered by the fence with Elias. They're talking about sending someone up here, she said. Officially. Elias leaned against a post, arms folded. To do what? Assess, Sarah replied, her mouth tightening slightly. Sure you're not encouraging trouble? Elias considered that. Trouble finds its own encouragement. Sarah smiled faintly. I told them that. 2 days later, the man arrived. He came alone, riding a compact sorrel horse that moved with disciplined precision. He dismounted just beyond the fence, reins looped neatly over his arm, and removed his hat. He was in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders but not heavy. his beard trimmed close and already iron gray. His face was angular, defined by sharp cheekbones and a narrow mouth that looked unused to smiling. His eyes were dark, assessing, and missed very little. "Name's Henry Walsh," he said. "County Marshal." Elias nodded. "Elias Crowley." Walsh studied the fence, the cabin, the tracks pressed into snow both inside and out. "You're living farther out than most folks I know," he said. "That tends to draw attention." "I didn't come looking for it." "No," Walsh agreed. "But you built something that people talk about." He paused, then added, "Saved a few lives by most accounts." Elias said nothing. Walsh stepped closer, stopping where the sharpened posts demanded respect. "I'm not here to shut you down," he said. "I'm here to understand whether what you're doing makes things safer or worse." "And what do you see?" Elias asked. Walsh took his time answering. "I see a man who didn't wait for permission to survive," he said finally. "And I see a forest that hasn't decided yet whether to accept that." Tom Reed shifted in his chair near the door. "Forest already decided," he said quietly. "It's listening." Walsh glanced at him, then back at Elias. "Listening goes both ways," he said. "If folks start wandering up here thinking this is safe ground, trouble will follow." "It's not safe," Elias replied. "It's honest." Walsh studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. "That may be the same thing." He replaced his hat. "I'll tell them to leave you be, for now." After Walsh rode away, the clearing felt heavier, as if the weight of scrutiny had settled briefly and then lifted, leaving its imprint behind. That night the wolves came closer than they had before, not in numbers, only two this time, moving low and slow, their coats thick against the cold. They approached from the northern rise, testing the reinforced section of fence. One pressed its weight against a post, muscles bunching, then recoiled when the sharpened wood bit into fur. The other circled wide, sniffing for weakness. Elias stood inside the fence, rifle still slung, lantern hanging at his side. Bran took a step forward, hackles raised but silent. Ash shifted, stamping once, then stilled. The wolves lingered longer than usual, their eyes bright, calculating. Elias felt the old tension rise, not fear, but the knowledge that balance was never permanent. He held his ground, letting the fence speak. After several minutes, the wolves withdrew, melting back into shadow. But Elias knew something had changed. 2 mornings later, Matthew arrived breathless, his face pale. "Cal's missing," he said. "Went out alone yesterday. Hasn't come back." Elias moved at once. He saddled Ash, gathered rope, a nintum, lantern, and rifle. Sarah arrived shortly after, having ridden hard from town, her expression grim. "Cal doesn't travel light," she said. "If he's not back, something stopped him." They set out together, following Cal's tracks northward into denser timber. Bran led, nose to the ground, weaving through snowdrifts with practiced ease. The trail told a story Elias did not like: hesitation, a change in direction, signs of pursuit. They found Cal near a fallen pine, slumped against the trunk, his leg torn and bleeding. His face was ashen, beard matted with frost and blood. His eyes opened weakly when Elias knelt beside him. "Should have listened," Cal rasped. "You still can," Elias said. "Stay awake." They worked quickly, Sarah binding the wound while Elias and Matthew prepared a litter. The wolves watched from a distance, shadows among shadows, but did not approach. The fence was far, but the boundary it represented seemed to stretch farther than wood and snow. By the time they reached the clearing, night had fallen. Elias opened the gate wide, ushering them inside. The wolves stopped at the edge of the light, then turned away. Cal survived, though the injury would leave him limping for the rest of his life. As he lay recovering near the stove days later, he spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. "I spent years thinking strength was loud," he said once. "Turns out it's quieter than I imagined." Elias did not answer. He didn't need to. The fence stood. The forest watched. And the cost of standing ground, measured in blood, restraint, and hard-earned humility, had been paid without celebration. Winter did not loosen its hold simply because men had paid a price. If anything, Black Pine seemed to grow more exacting, as though it were testing whether the lessons learned would endure beyond pain and promises. The days shortened further, the light thinning to a dull gray wash that never quite warmed the skin. Snow no longer fell gently. It came hard, driven sideways, packing itself into every hollow the land allowed. The fence around Elias Crowley's cabin stood firm beneath the weight, its sharpened posts now darkened by ice and time, no longer new, no longer questioned. Cal Rourke remained inside the cabin, recovering slowly. The wound in his leg had closed, but the damage beneath it lingered. He walked with a pronounced limp now, leaning heavily on a hand-carved crutch Tom Reed had fashioned for him during long, quiet afternoons by the stove. Cal had lost weight. His shoulders no longer filled a doorway the way they once had, and his beard, once trimmed sharp, had grown. Uneven, streaked with gray, he no longer bothered to hide. Pain had stripped away his need to dominate a room. What remained was a man who listened before speaking, a habit that didn't come easily but came honestly. Matthew Hale continued to arrive with supplies, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by others from the outskirts of Silver Creek. He had taken on the role of messenger without ever naming it as such. His movements were quieter now, his steps measured, his eyes trained to notice tracks and changes in the snow. The forest had not made him fearless, but it had taught him humility, and that proved more useful. Tom Reed, once mobile again, prepared to leave. His leg had healed enough for short travel, and he was restless with the need to return to his own cabin farther south. On the morning of his departure, he stood near the fence, long beard tucked into his coat, studying the posts as if committing them to memory. "You've done something here," Tom said, his voice low. "Not just built it, shown it can be done without turning the woods into an enemy." Elias nodded. "I didn't plan to teach." Tom smiled faintly. "You rarely plan the things that matter." They shook hands, and Tom disappeared into the trees, leaving the clearing quieter but not emptier. That quiet did not last. 3 days later, a small group approached the clearing from the south, moving cautiously, their shapes emerging one by one between the trees. Elias noticed them early and waited inside the fence, Bran at his side. Ash lifted his head but did not move, sensing no immediate threat. There were 4 of them, 2 men, 1 woman, and a boy of perhaps 12 or 13. They stopped well back from the gate, uncertainty plain in their posture. The woman stepped forward first. Her name was Margaret Collins. She was in her mid-30s, slender but strong, with wind-reddened skin and dark hair pulled into a practical knot at the base of her neck. Her eyes were sharp with worry rather than fear, the eyes of someone used to making decisions without assurance. They were the right ones. She wore a patched coat and gloves that had seen better winters. One of the men was her brother, Samuel Collins, older by several years, broad-backed and quiet, his beard full and dark. He had worked cattle most of his life and carried himself with the steady weight of responsibility. The other man, shorter and thinner, was Jacob Pike, a neighbor whose face seemed permanently drawn, as if braced against bad news. The boy, Eli Collins, Margaret's son, stood close to her side, thin and pale, eyes too large for his face, clutching a small pack with both hands. "We heard this was a place people could stop," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Just for a night, maybe 2. Elias studied them briefly, then opened the gate. They entered the clearing slowly, as if expecting the forest to object. Eli's gaze darted to the fence, then to Bran, who sat calmly, tail still. Ash lowered his head, blowing softly through his nostrils. The animals did more to settle the newcomers than any words could have. Inside the cabin, Margaret explained, their homestead lay farther south, near a narrow ravine where wolves had begun appearing at dusk. 2 nights earlier, something had tested their door. The night after that, their livestock had scattered, 1 calf taken. They had decided to move temporarily, seeking a safer route toward relatives nearer town. The storm had caught them midway. "We didn't know where else to go," Samuel said simply. Elias gave them food, space by the stove, and silence enough to breathe. He asked no questions that didn't need answers. That night, the cabin held more life than it ever had. The walls seemed to absorb the sound of human presence without complaint. Outside, the wolves gathered again, not close at first. They watched from the tree line, drawn by scent and noise. Elias counted 5, then 6. The scarred gray wolf appeared last, settling on a rise beyond the fence, its posture unmistakably dominant. It did not pace. It waited. Margaret saw them through the window and went very still. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Young Eli pressed closer to the wall, eyes fixed on the shadows. "They won't cross," Elias said quietly. "Not like this." "How do you know?" Margaret asked. "I've been listening," Elias replied. The wolves tested the perimeter in silence, one by one, noses brushing the posts, paws scraping frozen ground. The fence held. Bran did not bark. Ash did not rear. The wolves stayed until the moon rose high, then withdrew as a group, melting back into the forest with a cohesion that spoke of intelligence, not madness. Morning came heavy and slow. Margaret and her group stayed 2 more days. During that time, Elias showed Samuel how the fence was set, how the land was red, where wind and slope mattered, more than strength. Samuel listened intently, asking few questions but remembering everything. Margaret watched, absorbing as much as her brother, her mind already reshaping plans. "We can't stay forever," she said on the 3rd morning, "but we can change how we live." Elias nodded. "That's all anyone ever does." When they left, the clearing felt altered again, not crowded, but marked. The fence had become something else now, not just a boundary, but a reference point. Later that same day, Sarah Whitmore returned, her expression taut. "More people are talking," she said, "not about hunting wolves, about copying this." Elias looked at the fence, then beyond it. "It won't work everywhere." "No," Sarah agreed, "but it's given them a way to think that isn't just fear." That night, the wolves came closer than ever before. They didn't circle. They approached as a group, stopping mere yards from the fence. The scarred gray wolf stepped forward, pressing its weight against a post until the wood creaked. Elias stood opposite it, lantern held low, eyes level. For a long moment, predator and man regarded one another across sharpened wood and shared cold. Then the wolf stepped back. It turned, uttered a low sound that was not a howl, and led the pack away into the trees. They did not return that night. Elias extinguished the lantern and leaned against the fence, exhaustion settling into his bones. He did not feel victorious. He felt acknowledged. The forest had answered, not with surrender, but with recognition. And that, Elias knew, was the most he would ever be given. Winter did not retreat after the wolves turned away. It never did. In Black Pine, mercy did not arrive with clear skies or warmer air. It came only as a pause, a narrow window in which men and animals alike caught their breath before the cold pressed in again. Elias Crowley understood that difference. He did not mistake the forest's restraint for surrender. What had happened was not an ending, only an agreement. Temporary, conditional, and earned day by day. The morning after the pack withdrew, Elias walked the fence line alone. Snow had crusted hard overnight, sealing tracks into brittle shapes. The sharpened posts stood scarred now, some bearing faint traces of fur, others darkened where breath and frost had clung. He ran a gloved hand along one post, testing its stability, then another. The fence had held not because it was perfect, but because it had been honest. It said what it meant. Ash watched from near the cabin, his gray coat thick and rough, eyes half-lidded against the toskia glare of snow. At 9 years old, he carried himself with the settled confidence of a horse that had outlived panic. He no longer startled at distant howls or sudden wind. When Elias moved, Ash tracked him calmly, shifting weight only when needed. Bran followed at a measured distance, 6 years old now, dark fur flecked with frost, scarred flanks stiff in the cold. His ears never stopped moving. He had learned that silence was as useful as warning. By midday, Elias heard the sound of axes in the distance, not close enough to be careless, but close enough to matter. He climbed the rise at the northern edge of the clearing and looked through the trees. Below, in a shallow basin, 3 men worked at the edge of the forest, cutting saplings and trimming branches. They moved awkwardly, unused to the terrain, but they were careful. One of them straightened and saw Elias watching. The man lifted a hand in greeting and waited rather than approaching. Elias studied him briefly, then made his way down. The man who had signaled was named Peter Lawson. He was in his early 50s, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders. his beard grizzled and uneven, as if trimmed only when it became inconvenient. His face was long, weathered, with a deep crease between the eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into wind and sun. He was a rancher from the southern edge of Silver Creek, a man known for caution rather than boldness. The other two were younger, brothers by the look of them, lean, quiet, hands raw from work. "We're not here to cause trouble," Peter said before Elias could speak. His voice was steady, respectful. "Sarah sent us." Elias nodded. "What are you building?" "Trying to do what you did," Peter replied, "or something close to it. We lost 3 calves last week. Wolves tested our place twice after that." "You won't manage it by copying shapes alone," Elias said. Peter inclined his head. "That's what Sarah said too. She said to watch first." Elias walked the edge of their work, noting spacing, placement, the way the ground dipped. "Your land slope's wrong for a circle," he said. "Wind will funnel through here." He pointed with the axe handle. "You need to break the line there. Not straight. Let it curve with the land." Peter listened carefully, nodding. The younger men said nothing, but their eyes stayed on Elias's hands. "We'll adjust," Peter said, "if you don't mind us learning the slow way." "That's the only way it sticks," Elias replied. He left them to their work and returned to the clearing, the sound of axes fading behind him. The fence around his own cabin had become something he recognized now, not a wall, but a measure. Others were beginning to understand that too. That understanding was tested 2 nights later. The storm came down hard, wind-driven snow collapsing visibility to a few yards. The forest vanished into white noise. Elias woke to Bran's low growl and the sound of something striking wood. Not a charge, probing, repeated, deliberate. He was on his feet instantly, lantern in hand, rifle slung but not raised. Outside, shapes moved just beyond the fence line, darker shadows within the storm. The wolves had returned. Not the full pack, but enough. They worked the perimeter methodically, testing posts, circling wide, pushing closer than before. The scarred gray was there again, unmistakable even through snow. Elias stepped into the open, boots sinking into drifted snow. He moved slowly, deliberately, placing himself where the wolves could see him clearly. The lantern light cut a small, steady circle in the storm. Bran positioned himself at Elias's side, body tense but silent. Ash stamped once near the cabin, then held. The wolves pressed closer, closer than they ever had. One snapped at a post, jaws clacking against wood. Another lunged, recoiling as the sharpened point scraped its shoulder. The scarred gray watched. Elias without blinking. Then something new happened. A howl rose, not from the wolves, but from farther down slope. Another pack, smaller, more desperate by the sound of it. Hunger had pushed competitors into the same territory. The wolves at the fence stiffened. Their formation shifted, attention pulled outward. Elias felt the change immediately. This was not a test anymore. It was pressure. The scarred gray stepped back, head lifting. It looked once more at Elias, then turned sharply, leading its pack downslope toward the new sound. The storm swallowed them whole. Elias stood where he was long after they vanished, snow coating his shoulders, lantern flame wavering but unextinguished. The fence had held again, but not because it was stronger than hunger. It had held because it gave the wolves a better option than collision. By morning, the storm eased. Tracks crisscrossed the clearing's edge, overlapping, chaotic. Elias read them carefully. 2 packs had met and moved on. Pressure had shifted elsewhere. Sarah Whitmore arrived just after sunrise, her mare lathered with sweat despite the cold. She dismounted stiffly, eyes sharp. "They clashed near the ravine," she said without preamble. "No carcasses yet, but blood in the snow. The balance is changing." "It always does," Elias replied. Sarah studied the fence, the tracks. "People in town are scared again," she said. "But they're scared differently now. Less shouting, more listening." Elias said nothing. That afternoon, Cal Rourke rode in, awkward in the saddle, his injured legs stiff and poorly suited to long travel. He dismounted slowly, leaning on his crutch, breath ragged but controlled. His beard had been trimmed, his coat mended. He looked like a man who had decided how he would live from here on. "I sold half my herd," Cal said bluntly. "Moved the rest closer to town, built a fence. Not like yours, but better than nothing." Elias nodded. "You learned," Cal met his eyes. "I did, and I won't forget who made me." They stood in silence a moment longer before Cal turned and left, riding back into the trees with less confidence than before, but more awareness. As winter deepened, the clearing became quieter. Fewer wolves passed through, more men learned to slow their steps. The forest did not become safe, it became understood. One evening, as Elias sat by the stove sharpening tools, he realized something had changed in him as well. He no longer listened for danger alone. He listened for movement, for rhythm, for the way the land adjusted to what had been placed within it. The fence was no longer just wood and labor, it was part of the conversation. Outside, Blackpine held its ground. So did Elias. In the end, the forest did not change because it was conquered. It changed because someone chose patience over fear, humility over pride, and protection over violence. Sometimes, the miracles God sends are not loud. They do not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, as a fence built with care, as a door opened in the storm, as a choice to stand firm without hatred. In our own lives, we face winters too. Moments when the world feels cold, when fear circles close and help seems far away. But perhaps God is asking us the same question He asked this man in the forest. Will you build with faith even when no one is watching? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone in your life who needs a safe place, a kind word, a quiet act of courage? Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you believe, as we do, that no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories of compassion, faith, and second chances. May God bless you. May He watch over your home. May He place peace in your heart and light on your path. And may we all learn to recognize the quiet miracles He sends us every day. Amen.